This video is brought to you by Squarespace.
Hey, new filmmakers, I'm Nick Bodmer.
I'm Griffin Hammond, and today we're answering the questions you asked about the new camera that I have here, the Lumix GH5M2.
Hey, Griffin.
Nick, I apologize that in our last episode, you wanted to ask me questions about the GH5. It had already come out, but we were actually recording the episode before the announcement, so I couldn't really talk about it.
Yeah, but now you can. Well, I watched your little short video kind of covering the camera, which I thought was great. I watched your short film, which was fantastic. If you guys haven't seen that, go check that out. It definitely popped. So I watched it on my 4K HDR TV downstairs.
Yeah.
And even streaming through YouTube, I thought it looked really, really good.
Well, that's good. I mean, YouTube is one of the places you can watch it in HDR. This is a 2-minute film I shot called Texture. I shot it on this new camera, and I delivered it in HDR and wanted it to look very colorful and bright and contrasty. And but yeah, if you kind of have to watch it on like an HDR television, like even my iMac Pro sitting here, if I pull it up on YouTube, it's just going to show me the SDR version.
Now, like a modern iPhone will show it in HDR too, right?
Yes. Yeah. I think if you watch it on YouTube on an iPhone, yeah, it should work. You'll want to make sure your settings are actually showing the HDR version and not the SDR version.
Right.
Yeah.
But I watched it on my big TV. It looked great.
Yeah. Well, and
so what do you think of the camera, man? It's kind of a cool upgrade.
Yeah, it's a great camera, and I think I've seen some comments. I think some people were disappointed, like, oh, it's not the GH6. It's not like a revolutionary upgrade over the GH5, but it certainly is everything you love about the GH5, and then they gave it a bunch of new features that the GH5 just wouldn't be capable of. The GH5 is 4 years old. I talked on a Lumix Live video with Sean Robinson, who works at Panasonic, last week, and he talked about how the GH5, it's a 4-year-old camera. It has a slower processor, and it's limited in what new features they can add to it. But the GH5M2 is a modern camera with a modern processor, and so they were able to give it several new features. The main one that affected this film that I shot is this film is in C4K, so the full 4096 pixels wide, 2160 tall, and shot it in 60, which you could do on the GH5, but you couldn't do it in 10-bit color, and you can do that now. I'm not even sure you could do. Let's see, what are the modes? Yeah, on the GH5 you could do 10-bit 422 in 4K 30 frames a second in regular 4K, but you could only do 24 frames a second in C4K, and now they've upped that, so now you can fully do 30 frames in 10-bit 422, or you can do 60 frames in 10-bit 420, which is what I shot this film in.
Beautiful. So before, we've got a bunch of questions from people, Griffin, but I'm wondering, what's your number one favorite feature on the new camera?
I mean, I've always loved the battery life on these cameras, so I do love that they actually gave it like a new battery that's a little bit bigger. It's 18% bigger. I also love that you can charge this with USB-C now, because my AC adapter that I have for GH cameras was kind of on the fritz. I think it's like 10 years old, and it's nice to know that you can just plug it into USB-C now and power the camera.
And be done. Yeah, that's great.
And then it also has this red recording frame that, this is really just a software issue, but I love that now when you're recording, it puts the red recording frame around.
We actually got a question about that. So from Spinning Yard Productions on YouTube, they say, I really like the red recording frame. The icon on the GH5 is small and can be missed. I think you said it's coming to the GH5S with an update. Any chance the GH5 will be included?
Right. So on June 8th, new firmware is coming to the GH5S. That's actually what I'm rolling with today. And so my GH5S will apparently get the red recording frame. I actually asked Sean Robinson at Panasonic about this question, and he said what I figured would be the answer. I mean, who knows? They may do it. They're always adding new stuff via firmware, but he did make it sound like the GH5, being a 5-year-old or 4-year-old camera, is kind of at its limit of what they can ask the processor to do.
I know that there were a couple people commenting in the chat like, hey, you know, this just looks like a firmware update. You know, why, you know, can the GH5 get these updates? And it legitimately, the 5 has hit a wall, which is why there's a new model. The Mark II, it's got a new processor. That's what enables us to do things like the Cinema 4K 60p at 420 10-bit
Right.
internally. It's what gave us the ability to do the improved autofocusing system.
It doesn't seem like it'd be much more to add a red recording frame, but then again, I wouldn't be surprised if they just can't do it, or it's not a priority. You know, who knows? But
so let me make sure I've got it. GH5 Mark II has it. Boom, out of the box.
Yes.
GH5S is going to get it with an update. GH5 is a question mark, but it sounds like it's not on the roadmap right now.
Right. I mean, I have no idea what they internally are planning, but it would make sense if they didn't do it. Also, you know, I'm not someone who sells cameras, but like, it would make sense from a marketing standpoint not to put it on the old camera, because it's like a cool new feature that's part of the new camera that they want you to buy.
All right, I'm just gonna hammer you with these questions. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Because
yeah.
we got a lot. I love it. Bernie Rafe asks, I'm a little confused about the new live streaming functionality in the GH5 Mark II that you mentioned, as I can already live stream on my GH5 in conjunction with Lumix Tether and OBS software. I had a very similar question. I was wondering, what does live stream actually mean?
Yeah, and this is probably my fault for the way that I phrased it in my quick GH5 Mark II update video. I think I mentioned, it can do live streaming. Maybe I don't even remember if I used the word wireless. It is wireless live streaming. So the camera, the GH5 could already connect to Wi-Fi to do a series of things. You could use it to connect to your phone. You could use it to I think you could send files and stuff. But now, through its Wi-Fi capability, you can just directly live stream to Facebook or YouTube or services like that. So you can just walk around with the camera now. You don't have to be plugged into a computer. So that's the difference.
Is it still going through a computer but wirelessly, or does it talk directly to those streaming services?
I think my understanding is that it talks directly to the streaming services. That it's
that's very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. I wonder how. I would love for you to test that, because that seems like something that could be tricky.
Right. Well, and one of the cool things, like you mentioned, like Bernie mentioned in his question, you can use the Lumix Tether software to live stream through that software. I plugged in my GH5 Mark II to my computer through USB-C into Lumix Tether, and also noticed it was getting power that way. So it's kind of nice as a live streaming camera. I mean, you probably still do want to do wired live streaming all the time. It's probably going to be, I bet that'll work better than live streaming directly from your camera. But if you plug directly into the computer, you can also get power, which if it's the right power delivery system, it could completely power the camera.
That's amazing. We got a comment on YouTube from Jake Wood, who just comments, "Man, I feel like I've fallen so far behind on what camera gear is in and out. It's so intimidating to me now." Griffin, should Jake be intimidated?
No, I mean, I feel this way too, especially as someone who tries to put out content that's educational and talking about new gear. I get intimidated that I always feel like I'm behind. There's no way that I can know everything about all of, even just all of Panasonic's cameras. I wouldn't be able to keep all those in my brain. But, you know, I'm not always up on what is Sony doing or Canon doing. And sometimes I feel inferior as a YouTube content creator, because this is not my 100% of the work I do is not YouTube. I'm doing freelance work, and I'm working full-time at the Recount. So I'm busy, and so I always feel intimidated. But I just always try to remind myself that audiences do not care about this stuff. I mean, the audience listening to this podcast, we care about this stuff. And maybe some of you have the capability to watch my film and you can tell that it was shot on a GH5 Mark II versus a GH5. I doubt even that, though. Like, I'm happy to show off the new camera and its capabilities, but as an audience member, I could have shot it on the GH5, and as long as I'm lighting it well and miking it well, it's going to look great. So I just don't think you have to worry too much about it. I mean, you could shoot on GH4 and you can tell a good story, and that's what an audience is going to care about. So don't feel like you have to, you know, you don't have to buy the new GH6 that comes out this fall. You don't have to buy the new GH5 Mark II that is taking pre-orders right now. It comes out at the end of June. Maybe you want to. Maybe you do need 10-bit 420 in C4K at 60 frames a second. But if you don't need that, and you don't need some of the new features they've thrown in, if you don't need wireless live streaming, like, you don't have to get a new camera. You'll be fine.
Yeah, exactly. But for someone like you who does this all day, every day, like some of the new features, probably just like their quality of life improvements for you and like your process and speeding things up, etc. Right?
I mean,
Doesn't
they are.
you
I'm
can't
really
get
happy to
something
have
great
the new
out of older
features.
gear.
But yeah, I definitely don't need them to do my work.
It's actually so. Josh on YouTube also asked, "Do you ever get gear insecure when you're making documentaries or doing client work when using a DSLR when you have access to an EVA1 or other cinema cameras?" I'm gonna guess you don't get gear insecure anymore. You probably used to, and I think you're probably over it. Am I right?
Yeah. I mean, pretty much the same answer. It's like, again, I could shoot on a mirrorless camera or an EVA1, and the audience really will not notice the difference as long as you know how to like optimize each thing and you know what their flaws are. And I mean, like, you know, if you have a bunch of lenses, you're probably shooting in, there's probably one you really love because it's the best in low light, or it gives you the shallowest depth of field if that's what you are going for. I mean, you know how to maximize your gear to get the best look out of it. And if I had an EVA1, I might shoot a little bit differently because maybe it can do some things that my DSLR can't, but I'm always shooting to get the best footage I can out of whatever I'm shooting with. And the audience is not really looking at that. They're looking at, is this story interesting to watch?
Do you ever feel like maybe your subject or a client you're working for is judging you based on the type of gear you're using?
I felt like that happened 10 years ago when like mirrorless cameras were new. And, you know, I remember like I worked with William Shatner on a project, and he was kind of like, he was making a lot of comments about like, he was actually just really curious. He was like, you could shoot with that little thing that gets the footage you need. And I think he was impressed that I was shooting on this little camera. But I feel like it's been that long since people had a lot of comments about small cameras. Like now that's pretty normal. You go to a wedding, you know, the wedding videographer's gonna be shooting with a mirrorless camera or something like that. It's pretty common now.
Another YouTube comment from RW. Why did the footage look super digital and camcorder-like instead of the nicer look the GH5 had? My money is on the anti-glare thing on the sensor making it look flat. Maybe the light bouncing around gave it a look? Now, when I hear super digital and camcorder-like, I'm thinking that is more of a 60 FPS versus a 24 FPS thing, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think that's exactly what it is. I mean, this kind of comment, I see it a lot when I shoot 60 frame footage, which is something that Panasonic likes. So I don't shoot every project in 60 frames, or I don't edit every project in 60 frames. I'm often editing in 30. Sometimes I shoot 60 for slow motion, but almost every time I do have like a pre-production camera with Panasonic and they want to show off, they want me to shoot a film, they almost always want it in 4K 60. Because one, I think it's more popular in other regions than the US, like in Asia. And when they go to trade shows, they get to put a 4K 60 film on a TV, you know, a really nice TV that can show HDR, and it just looks really immersive and a lot of detail, and that's the look they're going for. They want a lot of information on screen, and I like that as a documentary guy, that 60 frames can just show a whole lot of detail. But when you watch it on a different platform like a computer or on a projector, I mean, sometimes your brain is just expecting to see 24 frames a second because that's what a movie is, and 60 just throws you off because it's a lot more frames, and your brain is telling you, well, everything I've ever seen that looked good, that was lit well and looked like a movie, also was a low frame rate and kind of juddery, and this thing doesn't look juddery. It looks like television to me. I mean, it could still be really well lit, it could still use jib moves and all these very cinematic moves, but your brain is kind of playing a trick on you a little bit.
Ramiro Berardo asks, Griffin, quick question, what gimbal is it that you're using in the picture?
I am using a Geointech gimbal called the Weeble Lab, which I've had for several years.
Works good?
Yeah.
Gaurav Kumar asks, you never talk about autofocus, neither good nor bad. Talk to us about autofocus a little bit, Griffin.
Yeah, that's another thing that this camera added is they've improved autofocus. They've also added several new autofocus modes that were not in the GH5. Like there was already face tracking, but now you can add face tracking. Well, now you can also do animal tracking and body tracking, but you can also add face tracking to other modes. Like I like to shoot in the single area focus mode, the little square, and you can add focus tracking to that existing mode, which is interesting. But the reason I didn't talk about it in the last video is I didn't use the kind of autofocus that you're asking about in my film. I don't usually use the kind of autofocus you're asking about. What you're asking about is continuous AF, the idea that the camera would keep changing its focus during a shot, which is something I almost never use. One, because I don't like, it's just not my style. I don't like focus changing during a shot. I prefer to let subjects come in and out of focus, or the camera moves onto something and it comes into focus. Or I think just because my style is to have very quick shots, there's not really time in a shot to see a rack focus or something. So
when you're shooting, you're using autofocus to set focus, but then the focus is locked for the shot, and you don't let it change.
Yeah, so in my settings, I have continuous AF turned off, but I am in autofocus mode on the camera. I'm not in manual, because I know that if I was in manual riding the focus, I would get it wrong half the time. So I am pushing the shutter halfway down at the start of every shot. It locks focus right away, and I start rolling. Now, if you want to do vlogging and you want this camera to be tracking your face, like right now I'm shooting with the GH5S, and I set my focus at the beginning of the shot and I did not move it. So when I move close to the camera, I'm just completely out of focus. If you want the camera to track with you, it has all those abilities. And I did test out the new GH5 Mark II because I know everyone wants to know how that autofocus works. I just set it here and let it just watch me work for 20 minutes. And I noticed several things. One, it works great when I'm using the 12-60 kit lens here. It also worked pretty well when I put on my 12mm prime. It's an f1.4 lens, I believe. And it didn't work as well as the 12-60 zoom lens, but it still worked good enough. I mean, it was definitely usable. The one lens that just I can't get good autofocus performance out of is actually the one I'm shooting on with right now. For people that watch the podcast a lot, you know that I normally shoot this with my 12mm prime. I love that lens. Today, I'm in my new office and I'm kind of messing around with a new shot. This is actually the shot I set up for the Lumix Live event that played last week. I am shooting this on my 25mm, so much more medium focal length than normal, compressing the background. This lens just does not seem to do very well with autofocus. And I don't know if it's that I have the ND filter on, which probably might be hurting my contrast in terms of trying to figure out focus. I think it may also just be this lens. It's a very shallow lens. Maybe it's not a very fast focuser, but it just seems like when I put it in autofocus mode, it's like half the time it's not in focus.
Oh,
so,
wow. Okay.
I kind of feel like the autofocus works great on the camera, especially with the right lenses. And this lens in particular, the 25mm, is just not a good pair for that system. I did ask Sean about this in our conversation, and he said that they're doing firmware upgrades for a bunch of lenses to help them along. And I think they actually have a version 2 of this lens that is more powerful and can make quicker focus decisions. So I may be stuck with it. May be that this version 1 of this lens may never be a great autofocuser. I should say continuous autofocuser. It's a really good push to focus. It nails it every time, but there's something about asking it to focus all the time that this 25mm does not do well with that.
We got another YouTube comment from Bill who says, "Hey Griffin, just watched the short film. Great work as always. Unrelated to the GH5 Mark II, I was struck by how clean the audio was. Could you share how you got such clean audio in a space that looked to be very echoey?"
It was a very echoey space. This was a studio, an art studio with like concrete floors and no furniture to dampen the sound. I'm glad that you thought it sounded good, because I was kind of worried about the sound in there, and not just because of the echoiness, but it was just a noisy environment. There were doors slamming in the background, and there was they had like a security system connected to their doors, so every time a door opened or closed, you would hear a beep beep that just rang through the whole space. And I don't know, Nick, when you watch the film on your TV, I mean, maybe you weren't in headphones enough to notice, did you hear the background door slamming and stuff?
if I did, it blended into what the environment kind of felt like, because I don't recall. Yeah. I don't recall it at all. I'm sure it was there, because I'm guessing you can't totally eliminate that kind of thing. But it felt like kind of a very busy space in a good way, right? Like I think that helps kind of capture what it was like standing in there.
Well, and I'm trying to use nat sound where I can. I want there to be sound that helps tell the story. And when you, I mean, this piece wasn't a very like audio heavy piece compared to like hand cut that I did 4 years ago for the GH5. That was a piece where you hear like lots of chipping of ice and city sounds. This had some like city sounds and bird sounds, but like painting doesn't have much of a sound. There's a little bit of like the brush sound, but I wasn't actually like getting my mic inches away from that to really capture those tiny sounds. So I definitely was putting in the room sound where I needed it, but my worry is that some of these sounds like door slamming are just happening during the interview, and they're not matching with something you're seeing in the B-roll. They're just stuck there in the interview sound. I was able to get rid of some of them. I wasn't able to get rid of all of them. I think one of them landed right on someone talking in a way that I just couldn't eliminate it. So I definitely left at least one door slam in the piece, and hopefully it's not too distracting. But those beeps, I was actually able to completely erase those. Do you know how I did it? Like the security system beeps.
Did you throw it into Adobe Audition and pull up the spectral view and kill the frequencies?
That's exactly right. Yeah, if you're in Adobe Audition and you have your waveform, but then you can also load the spectral. What is it called? Spectral frequency
I called
view.
It spectral view, but it shows like from low frequency to high, and then the color changes by intensity, so you can kind of see where there's noise. And I'm sure those beeps were quite high up and easy to see.
Yeah, and I'm not even great at reading the spectral frequency view, but in Audition it works pretty well that you can kind of do this by trial and error. I mean, like you said, you can kind of see like a hot spot, especially for a sound like a beep. It really shows up in one place. But you can also just drag a little selection tool over the frequency, and once you select something, you can push the space bar to play, and it'll just play back what you've selected. So kind of by trial and error, you can just select a bunch of things and go, when does it sound like the beep? You can even narrow it down. You could be like, I'm going to select the entire bottom half of the frequencies and see what they sound like by themselves. And you're like, oh, it's not in there. And let me go to the top half. I mean, you could just keep doing that until you've really narrowed in on it. And then once you've selected just that thing you don't like, you can either just delete it, and that actually usually works pretty well, or you can also do like an auto heal, and it will try to kind of like content aware in Photoshop. It will try to fill in what it thinks should be. I actually don't always have the best results with that. So a lot of times I just delete the bad thing.
Well, that's one of the problems I've had. I mean, I haven't used that feature in years, so I think that auto heal must be new. But sometimes, like I always be like, man, I wish I could feather this like in Photoshop, you know?
Yeah.
So that sounds like maybe a good choice. You can try both ways, right?
It works really well for some things. Like the beeping was perfect because the beeps are kind of these distinct frequencies. They're very sharp and they end quickly. They don't echo too much in the space. The door slams were complicated because you can just imagine the frequencies
in a door
involved.
Slam.
Yeah. They're low and they're high and they really echo, and so they just took up a lot of space, and like I imagine they take up a lot of the same frequency space that voice does. And it may have even been in the mail interview, the interview I did with Andre, where I was having that problem. And so the door slam may have been taking up similar space as his voice, and that's why if I tried to get rid of it, I would just mess up his voice too much. So I had to leave one of them in because it landed right on a word. It seemed like when it landed between talking, I was able to get those out very nicely. But yeah, great question, Bill. I'm glad you asked that.
So we got a YouTube comment from Garth who says, love the film. Could you do a video or maybe provide a cheat sheet of the type of questions you asked to get the responses for the film?
Yeah, I can actually pull those up. That's a really good question. Because I think I was proud of my questions on this piece, because I knew, sometimes when you go into an interview, you just kind of want to ask everything because you're curious and there's a lot of potential interesting things that could end up in your film. But this piece that Panasonic hired me to shoot, they only wanted 2 minutes. And so I knew I couldn't put a lot in there. In fact, a lot of times I put my own voiceover in a piece, but this time I didn't even do that because I had plenty of interview. I had 2 artists to talk to, knowing that each of them could not physically talk for more than 1 minute in the whole film. So my interviews with them only lasted, I think, 10 minutes each. And I was able to ask really targeted questions to what I thought I wanted. And the thing that I thought was really interesting to ask them about, there's so many things you could ask an artist about, like their creative process. But I really wanted this film to get to this kind of meta discussion. It's like a new camera's shooting this. So it's like, I want to hear about color and texture and how they often don't render very well on video. Like, what is the difference between seeing art in person versus seeing it in a photograph or on video? And I thought that'd be like a fun theme to be hearing while you're watching a film shot by a new camera. So you're actually like thinking about the texture, and hopefully the texture and the color are coming across very nicely on this new camera. So I asked I didn't even write specific questions. I wrote here, my little bullet point is, talk about colors, lights and darks, shadows and highlights, what the human eye can perceive that a canvas can capture that doesn't show up in a photograph. So I really wanted them to talk about like the experience of viewing art up close and in person versus through a photograph. And then I also had a question that I think also got a really good answer out of them, because I think it was just kind of like an honest question that I had for an artist. It's like, when I look at art like the one, like art that good painters can create, I'm just kind of baffled because it's not how my brain works. So my question to them was literally, like, I'm a math person when I do filmmaking because I like all the numbers and, f-stops and frame rates and all that. But so I can barely, I can't even understand how you create the kind of work you do. So I asked them, like, what part of your brain lights up when you're working? What does this do for you in the way that like filmmaking does math for me? And I love that part of it. And I think that really helped me get them to express what it means to create art for them in a way that, if I just asked like, what's fun about being an artist? Like, I'm not going to get the answer I want, the targeted answer that I know is going to fit in the piece.
Especially knowing you have limited time with these people, right? I mean, if you said about 10 minutes each, it's kind of amazing you were able to get what you got in such a short amount of time. So it
was actually kind of rushed for the interview part of the shoot, because I think I didn't realize how short on time we were, which is kind of the case with a lot of documentary work. You ask for permission, you ask for access, and then you just kind of take what you can get. And at some point they were like, oh, we have a meeting we got to go to soon, so we got to do these interviews right now. And it's like, oh, okay. I wasn't even entirely done shooting B-roll, but let's do these interviews really fast. So I actually didn't even put the camera on a tripod. I think I was in the middle of shooting some jib stuff and just decided to just lock down the jib, and I just walked the jib into the place where I wanted to set up the lights and shoot the interview, and I just left it on there. I was a little bit nervous about that because when I it's like when I got everything set up and like hit record, I think the camera was kind of like wobbling with the jib a little bit. I was like, just calm down, don't touch it anymore. Just let it settle.
In-body image stabilization takes care of that. Don't worry.
Yeah. But yeah, I definitely didn't even shoot the interviews in the ideal way that I would have loved to. So this was definitely a rushed, real life documentary project. I actually should tell you one more thing that kind of went wrong on this shoot.
Okay.
Did I tell you about the LCD getting stuck upside down?
No.
So this is kind of the funny thing about shooting with pre-production cameras is when Panasonic, I mean, this is the third time I've done this. Panasonic sent me the GH5 before it came out, the S1 before it came out, now the GH5 Mark II. And this is the third time I've done a project like this for them. And I'm used to now, when they send me a new camera, it's always like ready image-wise. They always make sure the camera is going to perform. There's no reason sending me a camera that doesn't shoot good images yet. So that side is always perfect. But then it's always pretty buggy because they like haven't finished. Like the firmware is like it's not even version 1. It's like version 0 point firmware. The cameras always like crash a lot. Like this camera, like they'll just crash in like certain scenarios. Like this camera, it seemed like whenever I would push the play menu to watch something back, if then I tried to push the shutter to take me back to camera mode, it would almost always crash. And it shows you an error that you never see on the final production camera. It's like a weird little error that only I get to see. So I have to deal with a lot of those little issues. But then when they come out with version 1 of the firmware, they always go away. The problem I was having on this camera, the first version of the firmware they sent me, you know how when you flip the LCD around, it has to flip the image to match? It just wasn't doing that in predictable ways. Like sometimes it was doing it, sometimes it wasn't, or sometimes it would be really slow. But if you look really carefully at the behind-the-scenes footage I shot in that piece that I put out last week, the short behind-the-scenes video, if you look really carefully, especially at some of the jib shots, like where the camera's 5 feet away from me on a jib, if you look carefully, the LCD is just upside down. Like I'm shooting a shot, but the shot is completely upside down.
Now, the recording came out fine, right? It's just the display.
It just wasn't displaying it properly, which also was something that slowed me down a little bit. There were times when I couldn't quite see my shot properly. And that's just something you have to deal with a pre-production camera. And then, you might be nervous about getting a new camera if it does those sorts of things. But I'll tell you, this camera, they just gave me the version 1.0 firmware. That problem completely went away. And yeah, you wouldn't expect that to be a problem because it works perfectly on the GH5 and it works perfectly on the GH5 Mark II when you have the right firmware installed.
1.0.
Yeah, 1.0 works great. But that's just kind of a funny thing. Every time I've worked with a pre-production camera, I have to deal with these little quirks.
That's kind of fun.
Yeah.
Well, what do you say we thank our sponsor?
Yeah, we should.
Handy Filmmakers is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your filmmaking business. And
I just made a new page on my Squarespace site. I made a GH5 Mark II page. It's just griffinhammond.com/GH5M2. One place I could put all the videos that I've been talking about recently, my film, my behind the scenes, all the photos that were shot, the behind the scenes photos. I even put my history with these cameras. So it's nice that I can build on my Squarespace site one landing page that shows you everything that I want to get across.
So check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Griffin to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Hey, I think you had a quick update about the Aputure lights we talked about last episode. Do you want to share that with us?
Oh yeah, we got a great comment from Quasnick Pictures, who I think we were talking in the last podcast episode, about these Aputure bulbs that are battery powered, and how if you put them into a ceiling fixture and you flip on the lights, they turn on, then you flip off the lights and they stay on because they're battery powered. And so we were talking about how you couldn't use them as a regular bulb, but actually Quasnick Pictures pointed out that you just have to put it into the right AC power mode. So it has 3 buttons on the front. You just click all of them one time, or do you hold them down? No, he just said simultaneously click all 3 bulbs in the bulb and they switch to AC power mode. Yeah. And so I did that.
So that'd be good if it's a practical fixture and you want your talent to be able to physically control it on or off. On set or something.
Yeah. Or if for some reason you were using these in a home setting, they're not really designed for that. They're designed to take on set or take on location to film with. But if you were just using them at home, you could put them in this mode. And actually, I switched all 8 of my bulbs to that mode because for me, it was kind of an annoying problem that you would, in their little case, you would plug in the case, you could turn on the case to charge them. They all pop on. And then when I would go to unplug the case or turn off the case, they'd all stay on, and I'd have to one by one turn them off through the app or something. But this mode works better for me.
That's funny.
I also want to mention, I was shooting this today on a different lens setup. We were just talking about this in the last episode. I realized I set this up for the Lumix Live event that I did last week, and I'm realizing now, I realized it as soon as I put my AirPod in, that I was putting in the opposite AirPod as usual, that I am looking to the wrong side of the camera, not where I normally look. So because I have my camera in the shot with the word Lumix on it, I had to flip your shot this week, Nick.
I don't like it.
So you're on the other side of the screen. You're banished.
I feel
to the other
reversed.
side.
Inverted.
Yeah. And this is, I don't have the same wide angle shot I have. Usually I have a very medium focus 25 millimeter lens. It's compressing the background. But also I'm in my new office now. This is a brand new space you're seeing behind me.
Very exciting.
I also probably won't usually do this much production for the podcast. Right now I have like a light spilling onto the background just to give it some more like green color back there. I also have a backlight hitting me over the shoulder and lighting up my hair. I always do a nice big soft diffuse light up front, but I'm not sure I'll do all this backlighting in the future. We'll see.
We'll see how it goes.
I even have a little eye light going, which actually I don't even know if it's doing all that much. Let's see.
Somebody else take us through the lighting setup.
Yeah. But yeah, we'll have to, maybe in our next episode or in an upcoming episode, I'll finally have to take you through my new office and show you all the Hue lighting I installed and the switches and how I'm using this stuff for filmmaking.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been talking about it for a while. I want to see it in action.
Yeah. And I pretty much designed, when we were talking about renovating the space in our house, we kept it an open floor plan, it already was, and decided to put my desk here. When we were first talking about this, Amy didn't understand why I would want to be like crammed over here with my desk, but I kept saying like, well, I want the maximum depth behind me. I love depth in shots, and so this is set up so that you could see a whole room behind me with the window so far behind me that it'll almost always be out of focus, depending on the lens I choose.
It's just beautiful. Just beautiful.
But yeah, I don't know if this will always be my podcast setup exactly. I might move the camera over here a little bit or something, but I like using this depth where I can.
I want to see the theater setup, because you got the really nice screen and projector and like a $15 audio system, so it's going to be great.
Oh yeah, there's you can see it in the shot right now. You can see my gray projector screen right behind me. You can't see the projector itself. But yeah, we'll talk about all that in an upcoming episode.
Love it.
And I want to go out with even more content for anyone who's interested. I'm going to do a little supercut of some of the conversation that Sean Robinson and I had about the new Lumix camera. We tackled some of the questions that Nick and I talked about today, but I'll cut together some of the other topics that we didn't talk about in this episode. And so if you want to stay tuned for that, you can keep listening to more information about this new camera.
Bonus content. Fantastic.
Bonus content, yeah. I could just make it an extra episode, but I think I'll just throw it in the end of this one.
So do we say bye now, or do we say bye after the bonus content? That's the question.
That's a great question. I'll say bye to you now.
Okay.
And
I'll say bye to you later. No, that doesn't work. So I'll say bye, and you can edit it however you want. That's the power we have as video production professionals.
Right.
So, my friend, a pleasure. We'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.
Good talking to you. Bye. I've been working with Lumix gear since, I think, 2010. I bought the GH1.
Yeah, that was one of the cool things, because back when I was up in Newark and we were getting ready, we were getting ready to launch the GH5. I remember sitting in a couple of meetings with Matt Frazier, who's a regular on Lumix Live here, and he was like, hey, you guys, we really got to take a look and connect with Griffin Hammond. He did the documentary Sriracha, and he could be so beneficial to talk to and kind of figure out, how this camera works. And that was, I think, the first time I ever met you, and it kind of was just so clear how well, kind of organized you were in what with the production and all that kind of stuff. And it's been really cool to see how much we've been able to do things with each other, company wise, and just kind of grow these things out and provide new products that hopefully add benefit to your work. So
well, yeah, I shot Sriracha on the GH3, and it was a great camera. That was a 1080 camera, and then I got the GH4. And yeah, I think somehow in my making videos about the GH4, I kind of got on the radar of Panasonic, and it was great that we were actually able to formally work together on the launch of the GH5.
And I honestly remember when you came to the office and we were doing that whole meeting, you came in and you brought us some sriracha, and I was like, I've never had this before. I was like, all right. With a project like this, in the documentary space, what kind of frame rates are you typically seeing is recorded in there? Because obviously a lot of people just to connotate video production with 24 frames. Is there anything that from your experiences that has kind of like shown what frame rates you're typically going to use?
Well, I do shoot in 60 a lot, and there are several reasons why. I don't like 24 that much. I know a lot of people watching shoot exclusively 24 because it's so cinematic. But I just find with movement, with like gimbal moves and slider moves, even just that jump from 24 to 30 frames can be so dramatic in terms of stutter. You get less judder between the frames. So I like 30, and 30 is what television is. It's what a lot of my clients want. When I work at the Recount, everything we put out is 1080-30. And when I worked at Bloomberg Television, everything was 1080-30. And so I always kind of hate shooting in 24 and trying to conform it to 30. It doesn't look great. And then I love shooting 60 because you can either just cut the frame rate in half and it plays pretty well, or you can go to slow motion and it looks beautiful. Or sometimes I have clients that actually want the work in 60, and Panasonic always likes to see 4K 60 because when you take it to a trade show and put it on a TV, it looks very immersive and beautiful. And I know some people, when they watch 60 online, I think sometimes it looks better on a TV than it does on the internet. If you're not expecting to see 30, sometimes people are, or 60, sometimes people are like, this looks weird. It's like too realistic, or it's like looks like a soap opera effect. And that's really just your brain playing tricks on you. Like you've learned over time that movies look cinematic, and some of that is like a slow frame rate. So when you see a faster frame rate, your brain is like, what is this? This is not a movie. But I do think that 60 captures a lot more detail and a lot more movement. It's literally twice as much information per frame. And so there's a lot of detail that you can capture in that. And so it's great for, maybe not for making your very cinematic masterpiece, but I think for telling a story about something that really happened, 60 is a really fun frame rate to shoot in.
All of these projects, especially the Chicago piece that you did, I loved seeing it in 60p because there was so much of, the texture in the art pieces that if it was in 24 would be kind of, at least the way I feel, it would be kind of like smudged a bit. Like you wouldn't see as crisp of, kind of detail there. So
that's right. One of the films I did for the launch of the GH5 4 years ago, this film called Hand Cut, it has all this like ice chipping happening in it. And to your point about motion blur, if you are following the 180 degree shutter rule, which these cameras will let you just dial it into 180, if you're shooting 24 frames a second, that's going to be a 1/48th of a second shutter. If you're shooting at 60, you have a 1/120th of a second shutter. So it's a much faster shutter in 60p. And so, literally when you're seeing an ice chip flying through the air, it's the difference between like, do you want it to be blurred this long or do you want it to be blurred this long? And so the detail really does come through.
And you can still shoot 60p and just use a 360 degree shutter if you want a really long kind of blurry motion effect, or you shoot faster and you get more of a staccato sharp effect. So understanding what your goal is and knowing what frame rate's going to end up benefiting you, I think is a really cool thing. And how did time on the shoot kind of work for you? Were there any kind of like standout additions to the camera that, made the shoot easier for you, or were kind of just really stick in your head when you were in the process?
Well, it's such a simple thing, but the thing that always jumps out to me is the red recording frame around the LCD. I think this is something that I've talked about in meetings with Panasonic. Like, I'd love to see this on the camera. I think ever since I started using like Atomos recorders and seeing the red recording frame, it just seems like such an elegant way to show recording. And I know, I guess it seems like a really superficial thing, but I always think back to this story that happened to me on the 2016 campaign trail. I was interviewing Bernie Sanders, and we had like a 10-minute sit-down interview with him. And I had a second shooter who was like, oh, I can get the second shot. Like, I was shooting the close-up of Bernie Sanders, and he was going to get the close-up of our host. And we start going. He kind of knows my gear, and I trust him to shoot this thing. We get to the end of the interview, and he says, so I was rolling, right? Like that little red camera icon in the top left. And I was like, no, that's just the movie mode icon. You weren't rolling at all. And I just think about like that little like blinking red dot for recording. It's just not, it's kind of subtle. And if you're new to the cameras, you might not know. But I feel like the red recording frame is it just hits you over the head that you're recording. And I don't think he would have made that mistake if he'd experienced that thing. And this is the first time I've shot anything in HDR for an HDR delivery. So I took advantage of the 10-bit color, shot it in Vlog. We took all that dynamic range and edited it in, BT 2020 is the color space for HDR. And then I color corrected it, but don't have enough experience with that. I also don't know how. It's like the camera's ahead of the like YouTube technology. I don't even know how to upload HDR to YouTube yet. But Photo Joseph knows how to do it, and so he prepped my file and made the little like embedded LUT that goes inside I guess it's in the metadata. So when you upload it to YouTube knows I have an HDR file. I can play that back. That's the one that I made, but then we added a LUT so that it knows how to play it in SDR.
You know, Netflix and Amazon Prime and HBO Max and all of these different platforms, they're all pushing HDR. That is the standard. You have to be able to capture information so that it can be mastered in HDR. But for anyone that's going into this, one of the catches that you have to be aware of is if you load HDR content onto YouTube and you've got it set right, and YouTube has very clear recommendations online of like, hey, it's got to be this color space, this white point, all that kind of stuff for it. The part that most people don't realize that you also have to be able to provide an SDR grade or a LUT for it, so that if you're watching it on an HDR TV, it looks the way the filmmaker wanted it to be displayed at. Yeah. But then for everyone else that's watching it on a standard display, if you show that on it, it's going to look dark. You're going to have like weird blown out highlights and clipping and color shifting and stuff. So
like, I suppose you don't have to do the LUT, but you're just trusting YouTube to like make its own SDR version, which is not going to look great.
Exactly.
And one of the challenges for making this film is, I mean, my iMac here is not an HDR screen. Now, granted, Final Cut, I edited in Final Cut Pro 10. It has some pretty good, I can't remember what it's called, like tone mapping, where it's editing in HDR and it's presenting it to my SDR screen and eyes in an appropriate way. So it looks a lot better than what YouTube tried to do. But to check my work, especially because I'm new to this, I was like, am I even doing this right? Am I grading it right? I kept exporting ProRes versions, and then I would load them onto an SSD and put them into my Ninja 5 little monitor, which I believe is HDR. And so it was playing back correctly there. And I was like, oh, this looks good. Okay, I did a good job. Let me go back. And I'd go change a few shots, like, oh, these shots were blown out, or these shots were too dark.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually that particular kind of workflow about, having to take a look at, say, wanting to be able to edit and deliver an HDR. Now, granted, I'm a PC user, so that means that the best suite out there for PC for color grading is going to be DaVinci Resolve, but I'm primarily a Adobe Premiere editor.
Yeah,
that's why I got this TV that's sitting right off camera, because it's an HDR TV. I have my stream computer that's plugged into that, which is my editing rig and all that stuff, so I can be editing, work on it the way I want, throw it up on the monitor, actually view it in HDR and everything. And HDR displays are not standardized. I mean, they are standardized on different levels, but they're not standard across. You can walk into your local store and be like, I want that HDR TV, and know that it's going to be the right quality for you.
Right. Well, that's what made me the most nervous about making a film in HDR, is just knowing that, like, even if you follow the kind of the rules of grading it properly, I just know it's going to end up on some TVs where it's like completely blown out and like, there's gonna be some TVs that are like, that claim they're HDR but like really don't have the range or something, and it just mashes it down. I don't know. It adds a whole other weird layer of talking to clients. Like, you can imagine a client being like, this looks terrible. And you're like, okay, first we need to troubleshoot. What are you even watching this on? Like, I don't even know I don't know, are you watching the HDR version or are you watching the SDR version? Like, it does make it more difficult to try to figure out how people are consuming your work.
If I'm remembering correctly, back during when we were talking about the original GH5 and that whole project, I know that was, I think, around the time when you were letting us know that, like, hey, you're going to be on the campaign trails and all that kind of stuff and working with that. Does having a camera like the GH5, a smaller platform, does that actually help with access into locations when you're filming? Because it doesn't look like a S1H and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think I could probably get away with it with the S1 form factor as well. But I think generally you're right that having a small camera, there have been times when I've been denied access to an event, and then I tell them, like, look at me. I have this little camera. I'm not even going to bring a tripod in because I don't need it. I have in-body image stabilization in this camera. And they've let me in because they realize, like, oh, you don't actually need to be on the risers where we've run out of space and we have all these giant broadcast cameras. You just want to stand in the crowd somewhere. And yeah, I do want to stand in the crowd. I want to get a different shot that doesn't look the same as every riser position shot.
I want to thank you, Griffin. I know for everyone that wants to follow you and kind of keep up to date with the things you're doing, maybe check out the podcast that you got. Where can everyone find you and listen to the podcast?
Yeah, I would recommend everyone just go to my website, griffinhammond.com. In fact, I have a landing page right now specifically about the GH5 Mark II. It's just griffinhammond.com/GH5M2, which has the film we talked about today. It has a behind-the-scenes look. You'll find my podcast there. I have some more information about my other films that I've made with Lumix cameras. But yeah, I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. You can find me in all those places.
Yeah.
And I'm on YouTube, of course.
Yeah, there you go. Well, the link is dropped in the chat, so I encourage everyone, go take a look, go check out Griffin's work if you haven't already. I know a lot of people in the chat here were very excited that you were on because you have a lot of fans in the Lumix community. So
yeah. Oh, I meant to ask, do you have any letters on your shirt or hat today?
No.
Cool.
Nope. You gonna flip me?
I think I am.